You here this morning, and I'm so glad that you were able to find a place to park. I know it's difficult this morning. We'd like to continue our Mai Fest series with a lecture by Dag Schjeldrup-Ebbe, who is a musicologist from the University of Oslo. We're so pleased that he, a year ago at this time, through our connection with Bill Halverson, was able to come and evaluate our Scandinavian Music Collection. And his talk this morning is based on his 2-week stay last year and discussing some of the important items that he found in this collection. We're also pleased that Jill Daw and Janet Gottschalk will be able to give some live musical examples of those pieces. So, Dag, very warm welcome. Thank you.
Leland Saturn, and I'd hoped to say Robert Carlin, but he hasn't arrived yet because of difficulty with parking. And many other friends from my several earlier visits to Augsburg, ladies and gentlemen. First, initially, I like to make a little apology because I'm not a native speaker of English. Please bear with me for reading of most of my lecture from these notes. First of all, I'd like to express my deep gratitude to Augsburg College for inviting me to this festival and to come here today to provide some information about the buried treasure, as it has been called, the very large and important collection of Nordic music that has been uncovered in the Augsburg College library. I use purposely the term Nordic music, not Scandinavian music, as the word Nordic is a broader term that includes not only the Scandinavian countries proper, Norway, Sweden, and possibly Denmark, but also Finland and Iceland. I think the name of the collection should be altered to the Nordic collection, as Finns and Icelanders may not be too happy in finding the music of their countries listed as belonging in a Scandinavian collection. Excuse me. I shall start by outlining the history of the collection, how it came to Augsburg and was recently rediscovered, and during the last year was expertly catalogued by computers so that its materials would be readily available to users both here in Minneapolis and elsewhere. I will then say something about the general significance of the collection and also make some suggestions about how it in the future could be made to practical use for scholars and musicians. In the last part of my lecture, we will hear some songs from the collection sung by Ms. Janet Gottschalk-Ebbe. We are going to listen to 2 songs by Otto Winter Hjelm, Edvard Grieg's colleague, who was 6 years older than Grieg, and they will be heard here today probably for the first time outside of Norway. Those are 2 songs from a set of 6 Winter Hjelm songs published in Stockholm in 1866. This set, which will be sung in its entirety at the concert on Monday, is completely unknown today, and it constitutes, in my view, the golden nugget, if I may use such a term, of the entire collection. for a particular and highly interesting reason. Thus, towards the end of my lecture, I will try to make a comparison between those two songs and two songs by Grieg that we will also be hearing. One of the songs, Little Lad, has the same text. The other Grieg song, the very famous Solveig song from his incidental music to Ibsen's play Peer Gynt, bears a remarkable likeness to one of Winter-Hjelm's songs, The Boy and the Fairy Girl, a similarity that may or may not be coincidental. This likeness will, I think, be quite obvious to us here, and in my opinion, it may be the most interesting discovery in the whole collection. The history of the Nordic collection, in respect of the vast majority of the works now housed here, goes back to the middle 1960s. The prime mover in acquiring the collection was music professor Robert Karlin. With his deep interest in Nordic music, he spent a considerable time in Scandinavia, particularly in Sweden, the land of his ancestors, where he was honored by King Carl Gustav by being awarded the King's Personal Gold Medal for his contributions to Swedish music. Around 1960, as a fellow of the American Scandinavian Foundation, he traveled widely in the Nordic countries investigating their music. Soon afterwards, he became president of the Midwestern chapter of the American Scandinavian Foundation here in Minneapolis. In that capacity, he was instrumental in having the foundation donate a large collection of Scandinavian or Nordic music. A very large number of music scores, often with parts, sheet music items, as well as recordings, dating from about 1910 to around 1965 from the 5 Nordic countries to the music library of a small American college, namely Augsburg, where it would form a major part of the library's holdings. This music had, by request from the American Scandinavian Foundation, been given to that institution by the information services of the embassies of the 5 Nordic nations. So in 1966, the collection arrived at the Music Library of Augsburg. The library already had a smaller collection of Nordic music. Some of it had probably been donated by alumni of Scandinavian American extraction. And this included, I believe, the set of songs by Winter-Hjelm that I've just mentioned. After 1966, the library pooled those collections together. In those pre-computer days, the music was catalogued on small 3 by 5-inch cards. But unfortunately, funds were then, and in the years to come, lacking for making the Nordic collection properly available to users. However, 2 years ago, an opportunity arose for the library to brush the gathering dust of its buried treasure. An application was made for a sizable grant from the Aid Association for Lutherans. This application was happily successful, and the essential work that had to be done could now get started. An initial examination and assessment of the materials was essential. Some weeding out had to be done, as not all that glittered was pure gold. It was deemed advantageous to call in a specialist on Nordic music for that task. Thus, in February of 1999, I was surprised and happy to be asked to come to Augsburg. I spent an interesting and exciting time in the library, going through the large number of black cardboard boxes in which the collection was rather helter-skelterly housed at the time, preparing the materials for the professional cataloging on computers that was completed during the following year. All in all, there were no less than some 1,400 compositions, or about 35,000 pages of music, and about 500 phonograph records. Significantly, the collection is probably the largest collection of Nordic music in the United States and Europe, outside of the Nordic countries. Most of the materials were fortunately well preserved and in good condition, particularly those from the valuable American Scandinavian donation. Some of the other material predating that donation was rather strange and unfit for inclusion in the Nordic collection. Some was absolutely worthless and went straight into the wastebasket, such as some marches, dance music, and popular music by non-Nordic composers that had been arranged by Nordic composers and/or published in Scandinavia. Other pieces I suggested might be kept as mere curiosities outside the collection. Those included a number of compositions by American composers of Nordic ancestry. The collection, as I found it, was highly variegated. Many of the compositions I had never seen before, and there were quite a few composers whose names were completely unknown to me. The aim of the American Scandinavian Foundation's gift had been to provide a very comprehensive and fairly representative selection of contemporary music from the period between World War I and 1965. Generally speaking, I found the selections to have been made wisely and not haphazardly. All the major composers of the period were mostly well represented, and there was also a large bulk of music by lesser-known composers. Because of Professor Karlin's special interest in the music of Sweden, Swedish music was naturally particularly well represented by, I would say, about 33%, Denmark by 25%, and Norway and Finland by about 18% each, and Iceland by about 5%. There are hundreds of scores of orchestral music, often with the parts included. Most of the music is printed, but there are also a number of photocopies of original manuscripts. The majority of the works are chamber music. We are going to hear several representative pieces being performed at the chamber music concerts of the festival, one today, later, and one on Wednesday, both days at 4 p.m. Except for the masterly wind quintet by the great Dane, Carl Nielsen, most of the works we'll hear will probably be performed for the first time in the United States and will provide a new and, I'm confident, stimulating experience attesting to the quality of Nordic chamber music of recent bygone days, to which the collection bears strong witness. These performances of works from the collection, which I'm sure are going to be followed by many more in the future, is a realization of one of the main aims of the collection, namely to put the works to practical use. This can be done by concerts, by professionals, by students here at the college, in Minneapolis, and in other cities. The very essential cataloging of the entire collection, which was completed recently, will provide information to performers and students everywhere about the treasure trove of interesting Nordic music to be discovered here. It is my hope that performers will become aware of the collection and would want to include works from it in their repertoire. I also wish that musicologists and incipient musicologists shall become interested in Nordic composers and their music and write about their findings. Material for many concerts and for articles, term papers, theses, and even doctoral dissertations is certainly available in the collection. I am confident that the college does not want merely to rest on these laurels, but will be seeking to strengthen it and expand it. Hopefully, funding will be found for fulfilling such a significant aim. I was happy to hear the other day that a very large number of LP records have recently been donated to the collection. As I found it, the collection seemed to be weak in music from the 19th century. Many more important compositions from that century should be added, such as the complete works of Edvard Grieg, recently published in 20 volumes. Grieg is, as you know, recognized as the greatest Nordic composer of his time. Also in the donation of 20th century music from the American Scandinavian Foundation, I found that Norwegian music was not as well represented as I think it might have been. Oh, this guy is nothing but a real typical Norwegian nationalist, some of you may be saying. And that is true. I'm proud of it. Like so many of my countrymen, I am a nationalist. For 500 years of our sad history, we Norwegians struggled under foreign domination to preserve our national identity, not least reflected in our literature and music. and we did not become a sovereign independent country until 1905, when we separated ourselves from Sweden. I shall end this first part of my lecture on a merry note by telling you a little story that may be familiar to some of you, but which I think is quite symptomatic of the attitude of our Norwegians, us Norwegians. It's about an animal which certainly is not native to Norway, namely the elephant. Once a group of people from various countries traveled to Africa to observe elephants. When they got home, each one of them wrote a book about his or her experience. The Englishman's book was called People of Nobility Who Have Been Elephant Hunters. The Frenchman wrote L'amour of les éléphants, the sex life of elephants. The Italian, this book was called 100 Recipes for Pastas with Elephant Meat. The German's product was called A Preliminary Introduction in 5 volumes to the anatomy of the elephant's trunk. The Norwegian's book was called simply Norway and the Norwegians. Thank you. So it's then not surprising that I have chosen 4 songs from the heyday of Norwegian song literature to conclude my talk. As I mentioned earlier, Janet Gottsal-Fried will sing 2 songs from the Otto Winter-Hjelm set of 6 songs published in 1866 that I was so astonished last year to find here in Minnesota in the Augsburg Collection. I had hoped that this might have been the only copy of the unknown work in existence today, but when I got home to Oslo, I found a copy in the Norwegian National Library, and as the set had been printed in Stockholm, it's also preserved there. Winter-Hjelm is one of those composers who are totally overlooked today. In his lifespan of no less than 94 years, he lived from 1837 to 1931. He composed prolifically in many fields, but he was completely overshadowed in Norway by his more illustrious, and I must say more gifted contemporaries like Edvard Grieg and Johan Svendsen, and later by such composers as Christian Sinding and Johan Halvorsen. He was born and raised in Oslo, and first studied theology, but then he turned to music, and in the late 1850s he spent a couple of years at the Leipzig Conservatory in Germany, where Grieg and Svendsen later studied. He then went to Berlin for a year's study and started working on a symphony, which was completed in 1861 and was the first symphony ever written by a Norwegian, and a pretty good one at that. In the following year, he composed a second symphony in Oslo and used a folk melody as its main theme. This was a time of Norwegian national romanticism when many composers, in their enthusiasm for everything Norwegian and in their pride of our rich folk music traditions, wished to give their music a national imprint. The set of Winter-Hjelm's 6 songs, which we will hear in its entirety on Monday, bear strong witness to this. The first song today, Veslegutt, Little Lad, has a text written by Kristoffer Jansson, one of the first poets to use New Norse, our second national language, which in the 1840s was synthesized from various dialects. The poem Little Lad was also set by Grieg, as I mentioned earlier. We are going to hear that later. And when Grieg's song was printed for the first time 9 years ago, in volume 14 of Grieg's complete works, the text was translated into English by the Norwegian-American singer Rolf Christian Stang of New York. I read his translation first of the first stanza before we hear the work sung in the original New Norse language. Here is Stang's translation. Poor little lad on the hillock, he sits with tears on his cheek. He says, God help him who is so little. They shut me out 'cause I'm weak. Yes, God help him who's so little. How is he supposed to fight back? They kick and abuse him, both big and small, and trample him when they attack. we hear the song now? Little Lad by Otto Winterhjelm. The poet Christopher Jansson tries in this simple and rather naive poem to catch the idiom of folk song, and so does Winterhjelm in his equally simple setting with its short, repetitive, but slightly varied phrases and some typical small alternations between minor and major, as you heard. I believe you will have found the song to be a pleasant little one, but of no particular imaginative distinction. The harmony consists of but a few chords, but there are some expressive dissonances in an attempt to illustrate the agonies of the abused little lad. Before we now are going to hear a recording of Grieg's considerably more interesting setting of the same text, it may be relevant at this point to say a few words about Grieg's relationship with Winterhjelm. In October 1866, Grieg moved from his hometown Bergen to Oslo to settle there for 10 years as a music teacher and conductor. A month earlier, Winterhjelm had published in an Oslo newspaper a sort of welcoming article for Grieg. It consisted of no less than 6,500 words and was called not Norway and Norwegians, but on Norwegian music and some compositions by Edvard Grieg, containing a lot of praise for the newcomer. The two composers became acquainted, and half a year later, Grieg conducted the first performance of Winterhjelm's Second Symphony. In early 1867, the two men founded in the Norwegian capital the first Norwegian Conservatory of Music, for which they had high ambitions. Unfortunately, however, the project was not successful, and soon after Grieg went on a trip to Italy in 1869, the conservatory closed its doors. It looks like this led to a falling out between the two men, and their relationship thereafter was rather cool. So, the manuscript of Grieg's setting of Little Lad carries a date December 12, 1866, but the song was never published in his lifetime. That it shows the same text as that of the Winterhjelm song, which had been published in the same year, may have been mere coincidence, or he had seen the song and wanted to prove that he could do better than his older colleague. We will now hear Grieg's setting and let you be the judge. Was another song. I wonder if you, like me, find that this song, in respect of both melody and harmony, is far more accomplished than Winter-Hjelm's song. This song is interesting. It is actually the first song in which Grieg uses a New Norse text. He loved the New Norse language and came to write some of his most beautiful songs to the text of New Norse writers like Vinje and Garborg. It's also interesting that this is the first song in which Grieg, like he did in the instrumental works he had written during the preceding 2 years, introduced idioms from the folk music of his homeland. Now, finally, we have come to the most interesting discovery in the Nordic collection, the astonishing similarities between Winter-Hjelm's song, The Boy and the Fairy Girl, and Grieg's Solveig song from his incidental music to Peer Gynt. This again may or may not be a coincidence. If Grieg had known the Winter-Hjelm song, would he, some 9 years later in 1875, consciously have incorporated certain stylistic features of that song into a song of his own? Again, I let the audience be the judge of this rather embarrassing question that pertains to Grieg's integrity as a composer. Would he have risked to receive an accusing letter from a furious Winter-Hjelm saying something like this, "You miserable copycat, you"? No, I don't believe so. The case is probably one of the many strange coincidences in music. Grieg may, however, have known the Vinterhjelm song and may have had it far back in his mind as he unconsciously used it as a model for Solveig's song. That's my guess. We will hear Vinterhjelm's song first. First, I'll say something about the text, which was written by the famous poet Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson. It is one of Bjørnson's earliest poems and one of the very few in which he tried to write in the New Norse language. He later didn't think much of it and suppressed the poem, did not have it incorporated in the edition of his complete poems. It is called Gutten og Huldren. I've translated that as the boy and the fairy girl. I looked up the word Huldren in the Norwegian English dictionary, and one of the translations there what I found was wood nymph. Huldren, a supernatural being, is certainly not a nymph, according to my conception of what a nymph is supposed to be. She is a Norwegian female troll, a Norwegian female fairy or a female troll, akin to the green-clad one in Peer Gynt, the daughter of the mountain king who seduces Per with an eventual very unfortunate result, a little brat, the appearance of which forces Per to leave his beloved Solveig and go abroad. The green-clad one is a beautiful girl, but with one major defect. Under her skirt is hidden a long tail. Poor Per. And now I'll tell you something most of you don't know, the true story about trolls. I have asked my students many times, do you believe in trolls? Now I'm asking you, do you believe in trolls? Nobody raises their hands. I'm sorry about that. I do believe in trolls. They have existed, and I'll tell you why. When my father was a little boy, he had a nursemaid from Lom, one of the interior valleys, and she read to him legends and fairy tales about trolls. So my father asked her, are there really trolls? And she said, not nowadays, but in the olden days, there were trolls. And certainly they were. Trolls were outlaws, fugitives from justice. The harsh punishments in Norway just for stealing something, they might cut your head off. Anyway, lots of people have fled. That goes back to the Middle Ages, even as far as the 17th, 18th century. Those people who fled, they congregated in small groups or isolated in the woods, where they built wooden cottages, or they would hide themselves in caves, like in the Hall of the Mountain King. And at night, they would go down to the valleys to steal whatever they could. They would steal calves and pigs and chicken. And the people in the valley would see this. They would see these strange people with long beards who came there and stole from them. And according to the legend, the troll would burst at the sun rose, so they had to leave. And the parents would tell their children, please be a good boy or girl, or the troll will come and get you, because the troll is out there. And they would tell, those were the days where there was no television with scary stories or computer games. So they would tell stories among themselves, make up stories about trolls to tell their children, because children love to be scared. And these stories were orally from generation to generation. And in the last century, or the 19th century, they were still alive on the lips of the people. And there were folk tale collectors like Asbjørnsen and Moe, who wrote down a number of troll fairy tales and preserved them for us. And Ibsen's Peer Gynt is based on the story about the trolls that Per met, just taken from these tales. So these trolls, they came down and they wanted girls, so they adopted girls, and there are stories about the poor girls who are high up in the mountains singing songs to attract the attention of people so they could come and rescue them. And the trolls would have children, and they had girls, beautiful girls, Huldre, who came down to the valleys to get boys. And this is what happened in this little poem. So the Huldre is not a wood nymph, but a fairy girl who wanders around lusting for young men. In this Bjørnson poem, she finds one. He is puzzled about her, and there is a dialogue between them. I'll first read the poem in my translation, and then we'll hear the Vinterhjelm song. The boy, what is your name, you girl among the sheep who are blowing on a horn? The girl, my name swims like a duck in a pond. Row over, you boy, with a sheepskin hat. The boy, what's your father's name, and what's your farm called? I've never seen you on the way to church. The girl, my father has drowned, and the farm has burnt down. I've never found the way to church. Vinterhjelm song. This song is definitely much more elaborate and interesting than Little Lad. Here the composer again, but more felicitously, tries to imitate a real folk song by typical melodic turns and rhythms, by alternations between minor and major, and in the accompaniment by open fifths in the bass and sharp dissonances reminiscent of folk instruments. Winter-Hjelm was not the first Norwegian composer to do so. He had had a number of predecessors like Ole Bull, Ludvig Lindemann, Halvdan Kjerulf, Richard Nordrock, and Grieg. The most fascinating part of the song is its second section, where the key has been changed from A minor to A major, and where he uses the rhythms of the Norwegian folk dance in 3/4 time, the spring dance, Springar. Here the girl sings a vocalise on the vowel A, not prescribed in the Bjørnson poem. The composer evidently wants to reflect the style of a Norwegian lock, a shepherd's cow call, and very successfully too. This section bears a truly amazing resemblance to the vocalise section in Grieg's Solveig song, which incidentally was not prescribed in the Ibsen text either. Grieg has, just like Winter-Hjelm, changed the key from A minor to A major. The rhythms are now in 3/4 time, and the rhythm as well as many chords in the accompaniment are also alike. Some of these many similarities that I've discovered between this absolutely unknown Winter-Hjelm song and Grieg's should be apparent from the music placed on the overhead projector. You will notice how many of the melody notes are exactly the same in both songs, and that some of the chords are also used. Let's see Solveig's. Now Grieg's Solveig song. I hope you can see this. Similarities. Same chords. Exactly the same chords. No, one more stanza. We have to hear one more stanza. I hope the songs you heard here today, and we'll hear some songs from that set, all those songs from the Vinterhjelm set on Monday, will have whetted your appetite for hearing more Norwegian or Nordic songs and more Nordic music at the coming concerts. And now, as a small token of gratitude for having been invited here, I have brought with me a few personal gifts, some to two special people, including 2 music manuscripts, and some to the library. First, I'd like to thank Janet for her splendid and very beautiful rendition of the songs that illustrated my lecture. I'd like to present her with a book that Dr. Benestad and I have written in English, Edvard Grieg's chamber music. And I also have a manuscript of a small song that I have written. And another special person that deserves some gifts is Robert Carlén, who fortunately has got his car parked. Yes. Don't know how much of your lecture you were able to get, but anyway, here is something special for you. If it hadn't been for him, for his acquisition of the Nordic collection, we certainly wouldn't have been here today. And I probably would have been here today, because if he had not been kind enough to meet me on Monday when I arrived at the airport. And on the way here, I told him that he would like a book that Finn Benstad and I had written. We have written several books in English, several books in Norwegian, and he said, definitely the one in Norwegian. So I have one for him here, the first and only biography of Johan Svendsen, the great contemporary of Griegs. So I'm going to give, and then I have something else for him, which may be a little more rarity. The greatest Swedish composer of the 20th century was Carl Birger Blomdahl. He died, unfortunately, much, much too young, in his 50s. He has written the first space opera to a beautiful, beautiful Swedish text, Aniara. And he also wrote an interesting, wonderful symphony where he uses a 12-tone row called facets. And I happened to give a seminar on that work for my students in Oslo. Once he gave me a little piece of music. He had written the 12-tone row there, and I thought that would be a nice thing for Robert to have. Come up here. A couple of things, of course, for the library that might be of interest to them. Not that much. 2 little articles in Norwegian, my last 2 articles. We just heard Solveig song. We heard it yesterday in an arrangement, actually, for girls' chorus, which Grieg hadn't made. And then we heard the real stuff today. The first performance of Peer Gynt took place in Oslo in February 1876, and just shortly afterwards, Grieg had the work published in Copenhagen. Just excerpts from it, including Solveig's song. He didn't know then, of course, that Solveig's song would become his most famous composition. And it was printed in Copenhagen, and I happen to own the first edition of that. And I would like that to give that to the library. I think it would be a nice addition to the library. So. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your attention.